Welcome to ATSA's Backchannel. I am Alejandro Leguízamo, your host. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Nicole Bedera. Dr. Bedera is a sociologist, newly minted sociologist from the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on how organizations impact the experience of sexual violence with a focus on college sexual assault. Her dissertation was an organizational ethnography of one university's management of sexual misconduct complaints and the way Title IX can be used to protect perpetrators and reinforce gender inequality. She has also conducted research on queer women's experiences of sexual assault and men's attitudes towards sexual violence prevention. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bedera. So thank you for joining me, Dr. Bedera.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You are studying sexual violence through a different lens from what we are used to in the sex offender field. We tend to come from mental health, from law, from criminology, and I think that we need to have more of a exchange with, or it's not only me, we have been thinking about having interchange of ideas with other disciplines. So I was very happy to find your work in sociology dealing with sexual aggression. And in particular, something that we don't tend to think as much as we should be, and that is the perpetration of sexual violence against queer women, and also other issues of gender, in particular masculinity, that are involved here. So let me ask you a little bit about your research with the sexual victimization of queer women.
Yeah,
we'll start with that.
Let's get into it. So we were really interested in this study because we know that the sexual assault victimization rate among queer women is really, really high. It's higher, much higher than it is for straight women. The studies are kind of all over the map, depending on how well they measure sexuality, I think being a piece of it, but also just because this is a really difficult thing to measure, especially when violence is so prevalent that many victims will come to see it as normal or as acceptable, and it might not come up on a survey in the same way. But the rates are really high. On college campuses, some estimates are as high as half of bisexual women will experience a sexual assault while they're in college. Out in just the adult world, the rates are much higher, as you can imagine, with the vast majority of queer women experiencing some act of sexual violence. So we were really interested in why that is, in part because we found the state of the literature unsatisfying. So a lot of the research that was out at the time basically said queer women are sexually assaulted more often because they engage in risky behaviors. They drink more, they use more drugs, they have more sexual partners. We were quick to realize that all of those things in these cross-sectional studies were actually outcomes of sexual violence, and not necessarily, it was a big assumption to assume they were the cause of sexual violence. But we also just felt like the role of sexuality and homophobia and biphobia hadn't been appropriately interrogated. There were a lot of assumptions that it was the fault of the victim. And we wanted to sort of start over and ask survivors themselves about their experiences and about specific things that happened during their sexual assaults as a way of trying to understand, is there more to the story than just blaming victims for engaging in risky behaviors? And we found the answer was yes. We found that based off of the types of language that the survivors reported their perpetrators used, it seems that many of them were targeted in part because of their sexuality, and specifically a masculine entitlement to queer women's bodies. So this idea, for example, that bisexual women have consented to have sex with everyone, so they are incapable of saying no, came up multiple times. And so without understanding that piece of it, you can't really understand why the sexual assault rate is so high.
Yeah, I'm having difficulty digesting that. It's like, yes, cognitive distortions galore, but again, this is not an individual cognitive distortion, but more of a societal attitude.
Absolutely.
And I would imagine,
I mean, you think about, it makes me think about porn, for example. You know, there's sort of this trope in porn about what a queer woman is. And the whole idea is that, you know, queer women might be engaging in sex acts together in porn, but then a straight man will come in and they will refocus attention on the straight man. So there is this hypersexualization of queer women in our society as queer women's sexuality being something that men can enjoy as a kink or as something taboo. And a shocking number of the participants in our study reported, you know, without hearing each other's interviews, reported that their perpetrators used the very word kinky during the sexual assaults. It came up over and over again. So this sort of calling them kinky girls and things like that, those sorts of tropes are very much showing up in the violence that's perpetrated.
There's, I have been trying to think recently about when did this entitlement come? Because aside from rewatching Game of Thrones, where there's rampant entitlement, how there are cultures where no such entitlement existed.
Right.
So when did that start? I mean, this is just a random musing. I am very distractible. But so this entitlement comes from this belief on a hierarchy, on this dominance of the male over the female, whatever that dimension is. And in your writing, you touch upon what it means for queer individuals to either try to gain that dominance, that masculinity, or what may happen when one suddenly in some ways loses that dominance through a different gender expression. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we saw that masculinity was at the center of the perpetration of these acts of sexual violence. So we talked a little bit about the hypersexualization of queer women, and that the way that's connected to masculinity is the idea would be that if you have sex or sexually dominate through a sexual assault, a queer woman who is kinky, who is interesting, that is a testament to your own sexual prowess, right? That you have had as a masculine presenting person, that you have had a myriad of sexual experiences that make you more masculine, that make you more manly, to have all of these different things on your list of stuff that you've done. Right. And then for lesbian women, we found that there was an idea of ownership, that there's sort of this idea that lesbian women are targeted as a form of conversion therapy to try to make them straight. We did not find a lot of evidence to support that. We actually found the opposite. We found that the men who were targeting lesbian women wanted to be the only man they would ever be with, as a marker of their masculinity, as, wow, I am so masculine and I am so sexually desirable that even a lesbian would make an exception for me, was the kind of thinking we were hearing. And so masculinity is saturating these sexual assaults. And we found that to be true not just with cisgender male perpetrators, but also with perpetrators of other genders that still had strong connections to masculinity and strong masculine identities of their own that, like you mentioned, were not always recognized by broader society, especially in the case of trans perpetrators. When their masculinity was questioned by the rest of society, that came up in sexual assaults. That came up in what they were saying to their victims about why they were behaving the way they were and what they were getting out of the sexual assault. There was one case in particular where someone who at the time identified as a cisgender woman, but came out as trans the next day, said that this was the thing, that this act of sexual violence was the thing that made them feel comfortable and secure enough in their own identity that had been questioned by everyone else to finally come out, to finally be able to live the way that they wanted to live. And so there are a couple of things to take away from this. One is that masculine pressures of any type can create risk factors for perpetrating violence. That when there are masculine pressures on an individual and they feel like they can't succeed, that's really, a lot of sociologists see this as the purpose of sexual violence, is a way to regain control over a masculine identity that you feel like you've lost control over. The other thing to think about here is the way that we're not just talking about cisgender men, and that when these powers have changed, when we're talking about populations that have even less access to legitimate forms of masculinity, you'll see violence there as well. And I want to make clear from the beginning of this conversation, now that we're talking about trans perpetrators and people like that trans people are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. And that we're not talking about trans men being more dangerous than cisgender men. That's absolutely not true. But the way they experience these pressures to perpetrate are just a little unique. And so that's really what I want to stay focused on.
I think that is something for treatment providers who are treating trans individuals. I think this is something for them perhaps to think about and explore with their clients, that I would be willing to eat my shoe if I knew that this was being done systematically. It's not really something in our radar. Programs differ. Some are very structured. Some of them are a little bit less structured. But this idea of thinking about these gender issues for queer individuals, trans individuals, is something that is not in our radar. We can do a lot better teaching dating skills to cisgender men, and forget about like dating skills to queer individuals. And you know, there's a lot of problems because a lot of us are kind of like older, and whatever may have worked 20 years ago certainly ain't going to work now. But it's interesting that the concept of how they were working through their gender expression and how they were dealing with the power dynamics that came out of that. You have a concept in your article about righteous masculinity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this really underscores everything we're talking about the importance of, regardless of whether someone is cisgender, transgender, non-binary, whatever it might be, making sure their concept of masculinity is healthy and not based in dominance is going to be crucial across the board, right? And so the way that we found this coming up among any kind of perpetrator who was not a cisgender man was this idea of a righteous masculinity, this idea that and I want to be clear that for the study, we studied survivors. We did not study the perpetrators, but we used the language, the things that they said to survivors to sort of construct these ideas, which I think is a good method, because perpetrators are not always honest about what they said or why they committed an act of sexual violence. And so I like the approach we took, but I just want to be really clear that, you know, this is not coming out of the perpetrators' direct interviews. It's things that survivors remember them saying that came up over and over and over again. But we constructed this idea of righteous masculinity, which was the way that some of the non-cisgender male perpetrators, everyone who's in that camp, the way that they would say that their acts of violence were subversive, were anti-oppressive, were liberatory, because they were able to act in the same way as a cisgender man. The idea, so it becomes righteous to sexually assault someone is the thinking, because it means that, wow, I was able to access a white cisgender man's power, and I'm not a white cisgender man. So the argument was that it was liberatory. I want to be clear that this argument came up as a way to rationalize to victims that they should not tell anyone about the sexual assault, whether it was a friend group or police or someone at their university. It was a way of sort of rationalizing the violence away so that the victims would not be upset about it. And it was pretty effective. A lot of the victims did start to think, well, you know, if I do tell someone and they come to see the community that, you know, these are queer women who belong to queer communities as well, saying if they see our community as hyper violent, that's not helpful to us. That's not liberatory to us. But this concept of righteous masculinity, it's really just a framework that the perpetrators are using to rationalize their actions. I want to be really clear, there's nothing liberatory about these acts of sexual violence. The perpetrators are specifically, in this study, targeting other members of the queer community and further marginalizing them. So no, there's nothing righteous or liberatory about it, but that was the framework they were using to rationalize the violence.
I wonder about we have a really hard time finding out from the perpetrators why they committed the offense. Nobody that I can remember ever say, well, I'm an asshole. What do you,
I wanted more power. Yeah,
exactly. They don't say that. It's weird. They don't say that. Right. But there's a lot of, with juveniles in particular, there's a lot of power dynamics where the teenager that abuses their 7-year-old sister because, she teased them and he couldn't take it anymore. Sometimes I do these podcasts and sometimes I just think I'm like, oh my God, we're doomed as a species. But hopefully there's some work here.
The opposite about this study, actually, yes, which I know is kind of a weird thing to say, talking about perpetrators, but if you are first learning about sexual violence and you tell people in your life that you're interested in ending sexual assault, right? You say like, that is what my work is. You will hear from so many people a response of, oh, well, sexual assault's just biological, like, testosterone, men just act this way. They do in all these species. You can't do anything about it. And I actually felt the exact opposite of that after the study. I felt like the study provided some evidence that this is not about biology or hormones, that sexual assault is not inevitable. It's something that is socially constructed from our own gender ideologies around men's dominance. And so a gender role is a lot easier to change than the biological makeup of the human species. And so for me, this study, there's a little bit of optimism there to say, if we can really address the role of dominance in our current concept of masculinity, and we can create new, healthier forms of masculinity that are not based on power, I'm pretty hopeful that things can change. So I had a little bit of hope, which isn't, you have to look for it pretty hard in this type of work, but I felt like it was a lot better than, just this type of violence being inevitable, part of the human condition.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I think probably a few evolutionary psychologists and biologists that may be listening to these may have been having a little convulsion.
They may be challenged.
Exactly. Because you're right. If it's something that is biological, then it's like, okay, so how do we deal with that? It's going to be very difficult. But I completely agree with you based on those cultures where this wasn't the social construction of things. Even though they're the minority, they are there. So the issue of, like, for example, this one, I was able to express power or this masculinity by committing a sexual assault. The Apache, for example, the idea that a man would have to be aggressive in order to engage sexually with somebody else was the epitome of not being enough of a man. And so there are plenty of societies where these not the gender dichotomies, but these dominance, this being powerful and subordinate, are not present. And so the interaction between individuals doesn't carry this need for power.
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of societies, especially if you look back at pre-industrial human societies, that were a lot more gender egalitarian. And it's the patriarchal system and the role of masculinity within it that I see as the primary problem in why sexual violence continues to be an issue. And I mean, from a sociological perspective, we have noticed that there are some contexts that we consider more rape prone than others, right? So talking about kind of basic things like college athletics or fraternities and specific fraternities on campus, specifically high ranking, high status fraternities on campus, are the ones where we can reliably find a great concentration of offenders of sexual violence. But a lot of them, once they leave these contexts, won't continue to perpetrate. There's a social pressure to do things. For example, if your fraternity requires gang rape as a hazing ritual, a lot of the individuals who will participate to get access to this institution and this kind of masculine validation would never choose to do that. under a different set of circumstances. And so understanding the role of these masculine norms and the way that they shape our organizations and institutions, I mean, that's where my work is really focused, is saying, why are there men perpetrating these acts of sexual violence when it doesn't really fit with who they would choose to be without those pressures? And so how do we get those pressures to go away?
Which actually leads me to kind of like the second chapter, because also there is a greater and greater focus on prevention in our organization, and also a lot of attention on preventing sexual assault on campuses, because it's rampant.
There's a lot of it,
So what have you found about how to try to prevent this? How can we change those organizations in order to minimize, or ideally end, but in order to prevent sexual aggression?
There are a couple of bodies of literature that I find really compelling for prevention. And one of them is pretty simple. There's some research that came out of sociology, I think probably 20 or 30 years ago now, but they were looking at the different organizations where sexual harassment does not occur. And the big takeaway was that when there were organizations that did not tolerate sexual harassment, it didn't happen. And that's just a simple truism that I've been thinking about a lot in my work around organizations, right? So you think about college campuses right now. If someone is accused of sexual assault, schools sort of bend over backwards to find a way to rationalize keeping them on campus, to justify university inaction. That sends a message that that behavior is tolerated. So if instead, and it also undermines a lot of the prevention messaging. In some of my research with men specifically, they say, oh, I don't take that stuff seriously because they tell us about sexual assault prevention the same day they tell us that we're not allowed to drink underage. And we know that they know where the fraternity parties are. They know that we know that the school is looking the other way about everything that happens in those doors. So instead, sending a more clear message of saying, no, when this stuff comes to our attention, we're going to take a proactive approach, which doesn't have to mean that it's overly punitive. And I also want to remind people that universities are spaces of immense privilege. Losing access to one specific university is not the same as going to prison. It's just really not.
Yeah.
And that's just my take on that. But it does set a set of expectations that can follow people through life, right? To say that if you want to have access to an elite space like a university, you cannot engage in misogynistic ways. And that will be true when you go into the workforce as well. That's why universities, to me, are such an important place to focus on, because they set the standards for the rest of the workforce. If you say that sexual harassment is a way that you can bond and make good connections with other men, then it's going to continue. They've already been taught to do it in this particular setting. So that's one thing I keep in mind. The other thing that I keep in mind is that a lot of these practices work better when you're just in more gender equal spaces. And the earlier you start that, the better. So we found that, for example, comprehensive sex education has been really, really useful in reducing sexual assault across the life course. And it's a lot easier if those messages are coming from a young age than trying to correct damaging messages that individuals heard at a young age, right? And so that's a big thing. But I also just think about the power dynamics on campus. And so I just want to tell a story from when I was doing sexual assault prevention at a university. One of the universities had the weekend before spiked the punch that was around with a common date rape drug, and there had been a series of sexual assaults. The next weekend, they had another party, which is in its own right a little bit concerning that the university does not step in to say there are consequences for this behavior. So that's one issue. But when they do have their party, you would expect that everyone on campus is talking about this incident. Everyone knows that there was a slew of sexual assaults at this fraternity the weekend before. You would expect the fraternity to be empty. You would expect nobody to go. But in fact, the opposite thing happened, which, because it was a prestigious fraternity and sorority rankings were based off of how the men voted, which the best sororities were, and sorority rankings were important for a number of reasons in this Greek system, low-ranking sorority women rushed in to try to get access to these men, to try to build relationships, to try to improve their own status. So I tell the story because it really shows you the way that things are so unequal on campus right now,
Yeah.
that these hyper-masculine institutions have so much power. And you can see these dynamics in the Greek system, but also in college athletics and college majors. If you walk across a campus right now, you can guess which major is which based off of how nice the building is. And the ones that have a greater concentration of men are going to be the nicer buildings across the board, right? So it's very clear where gender inequality is lying here, and who has power and who doesn't, who has to ask for basic things, who has to ask for power on campus. And so rectifying some of these broader issues of gender inequality would go a long way too. If women in sororities have access to, say, resources from university Greek life, regardless of what their relationships with men on campus are, that they have value in their own right, that would have made a difference in this story.
I cannot comment on my building at my university, which is awesome. Awesome. Well, at least in Michigan, the psych building was beautiful.
Yeah, the sociology building was all right too. It's also Michigan. All of the buildings are pretty nice in Michigan. But when you compare it to the type of money that's being put into a new engineering building, I will say that the more feminine majors are the ones that are being shuffled into the old engineering buildings, right? So sometimes the buildings are not nice because they were intended to be built for a specific program, but just because a different program outgrew that building.
So perhaps with those fraternities and sororities, it should be the other way around. The sororities should be ranking the fraternities. And
a subversion of power would go a long way. Yeah.
Well, I think it's, I can't remember the name. I think are the Crayon in northern Cambodia, where they have the sex huts, where the teenage girl asks her father to build her a hut outside of the family hut, so that they can talk to boys. And basically, while the families go to rest in the evening, the teenagers kind of like go and flirt and play games. And if the girl wants to have some private time with a boy, she takes them back to her hut. But it's completely up to her her decision whether to go there and what happens once they are there. So any type of like misbehavior or not good performance leads to no more invitations. So the idea of sexual aggression is pretty, at least at the time, with cell phones and porn, it's throwing everything out for a loop. But back then, the girls had complete control over their sexuality. So the boys' behavior was very different, because any type of like aggression or really like angering the girl was the death of their social life.
Right. And you think about this in the context of college campuses, just how opposite it is, right? So in a lot of states in the US, it is illegal for sororities to throw their own parties with alcohol. And so if sorority women want to engage in the college party experience, which presumably part of joining a sorority is that you're interested in that, the only way they can do it is through building relationships with fraternities. They can't throw their own parties. They can't get access to alcohol any other way. And so that creates this power disparity where now men are the ones who are gatekeeping. They can choose who they invite to their parties and how they behave once they're there. That's a really, really different dynamic than if women were the ones that were able to say, you know what, I don't like the way we're being treated. Maybe we'll just throw our own party for a while. That's not even an option right now.
Wow, I didn't know that. Oh, okay. Well, we have a lot of work to do.
We do.
It has been a pleasure. Time has gone by quickly. I wish we had more time. But thank you very much. This has been very interesting and eye-opening about a number of variables. And we'll look forward to all the work that you will do. It's going to be excellent. And again, thank you very much for participating.
Yeah, thank you. And if I can just add one takeaway for anybody who's listening
to this
podcast, is that a lot of the time when we're trying to think about how to make our sexual assault prevention materials more gender equal, more queer inclusive, things like that, what we do is just write sexual assault scenarios with a male perpetrator and a female victim in mind, cisgender, and we just do gender reversals and we just change the pronouns and the names. And one thing that we really found in the study is that that is not representative of the experiences, even when a perpetrator is a cisgender woman and a victim is a cisgender woman, but that masculinity and gender roles still play a really big role here. And so simply changing names or changing pronouns is not going to be enough to address the role of masculinity. What we would recommend instead is to think about masculinity as central to your discussion on sexual assault prevention, but to do it in an inclusive way, recognizing that anyone, regardless of gender identity, could participate in harmful and dangerous forms of masculinity. So if you're thinking, you're listening to this podcast because you want to be more queer inclusive and you want to figure out the best way to change your own work, that's my advice. And I love.
And that's a good one. I really, really, really like it.
Thank you.
Wow, those are wise words to end with.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to visit us at ATSA.com. And I am your host, Alejandro Leguízamo. Until next time, thank you.